In this way, a concept of good and evil is created. In this way, let me close I don't want my pen to die. This is super heavy stuff, right? In this way, a concept of good and evil is created that seems to be altogether divorced from the natural concept useful, harmful, life-promoting, life-retarding. Okay, so let's see what this looks like, right? Because I don't want to go quick through this because you really need to understand this because I think it has enormous implications, right? Enormous implications. Actually, we'll use blue. Give the black the rest. Okay. So, in this way, a concept of good and evil is created, right? Good and evil. And we just talked about how this idea of good and evil, real quick. You posit the moral value, the moral imperative, those actions that conform are good, those actions that don't are evil. Okay, good. So in this way, the idea of good and evil is created. Right, so this is created, i.e. socially constructed, is created. That seems to be altogether divorced from, right? That seems to be altogether divorced from what? Is created. That seems to be altogether divorced from the natural concept. Divorced from the natural concept. What's the natural concept? Well, things in the natural concept are what? Some of the things in the natural... Actually, I don't want to make an arrow out because then it makes it seem like I'm talking. I'll write it within. Things in the natural concept. One thing would be... useful, harmful. I'm not going to write them all. Useful, harmful, life-promoting, life-retarding. Insofar as another life is imagined, it can even be directly inimical to the natural concept of good and evil. So that there's this created, this artificial concept of good and evil, which is divorced from, which stands outside from the natural concept, things which are useful, harmful, life-promoting, life-retarding, Next paragraph. In this way, the famous, right, I want to write this down, right? The famous, let me get some other colors in here, right? In this way, the famous conscience. And he has it in quotes. In this way, the famous conscience is at last created. In this way, the famous conscience is created. So this becomes also a condition, right? This created notion of good and evil that stands divorced from the natural concept is the precondition. This becomes the Right, this is why it takes me so long to read Nietzsche, right? This is like 2 sentences here, right? Good and evil, this created notion of good and evil stands outside of the useful concept, right? The natural concept, divorced from. And this created notion, which we just described, is the precondition for the famous creation of consciousness. Right? Consciousness is created, which seems to me to say that it doesn't exist physiologically. Which, if that's the case, someone please publish some articles on that and give me a shout out, because that's and someone probably already has. It's profoundly deep to me. I mean, this is like one of the hallmark gems for me in Nietzsche's text, right? In this way, the famous conscience is at last created, an inner voice which does not measure the value of every action with regard to its consequence, but with regard to its intention, right? It's not about the consequence of the act, it's the intent behind the act. This is clearly a critique on Kant. For those of you who don't know Kant well, for those of you who do know Kant well, know exactly what I'm talking about, right? This is like the shopkeeper example. You have to do an action, not just because the action ends in good consequences, you have to have the proper intent. And that's what makes the action good. It can't just sort of surreptitiously end or sort of capriciously end in a good act. The intent behind the act has to be good in order for the act to be good. So this is you got to really know your stuff. I mean, to really understand that that's a Kant reference, because it's sort of opaque, but he says, and I'll read it again, in this way the famous conscious is at last created, an inner voice which does not measure the value of every action with regard to its consequence, but with regard to its intention, and the degree to which the intention conforms with the laws. This is exactly what I said. The ability to, or the mandate for my intent and my action to conform with the moral law is internalized by the subject, insofar as, or by the moral agent. Insofar as the moral agent internalizes both the intent and the act, conformity to the law, this is the technical way of saying conscience. So what the philosopher does is we create the lie of consciousness. I'm going to say that again. What the philosopher, technically speaking, what I classify as a philosopher priest, right? What the philosopher priest does is creates the lie of consciousness. We tell you, you have a conscience. There's this inner voice, right? You have an angel on one arm, you have a devil on the other arm. And the angel tells you to do good things, and the devil tells you to do bad things. And you have to make sure when you're confronted with a decision, when you're confronted with something that you ought to do, you're at the moment to decide that you consult the good conscience and not the bad conscience. We create this lie that there is this thing called consciousness. And now this discourse on consciousness has infused itself within biology, and now our scientists and our biologists are trying, because of artificial intelligence, to create artificial consciousness. Well, Nietzsche would say, and I think this is very, very important, that if it's the case, right, if it's the case that we are presupposing the existence of consciousness without demonstrating consciousness, right, and this is more me than Nietzsche, but if we're presupposing the existence of consciousness without demonstrating consciousness, and, as Nietzsche has proven, this idea, maybe not proven but demonstrated, that this idea of consciousness is itself derived from this divorced conception of good and evil, right? And that's just conformity to the law, which we've already seen is a tool of government and control. Then the ultimate control is for me to have you internalize the beliefs that I espouse, not just to govern your actions, but to govern your thought. So now I need to create a whole edifice of thought. And that edifice of thought becomes conscious. So we as the philosopher nobly tell you a lie, because you wouldn't be able to internalize the fact that there is no such thing as conscious. You don't have one. There never was one. Right? All the discourse on consciousness is completely vapid. It's completely without merit, because there is no such thing as conscience. Nietzsche said it, I did, right? It's pretty heavy, right? That's a huge claim. That's a pretty hardcore move. Okay, so how does this look? Basically, we have, and I'm not going to redraw, bottom of page 26. Basically, the law stands outside of the system, right? So that, in a sense, the system, actually, I will draw it. Actually, I want to use black. The system is defined by this border, right? So this is the system. And the law creates the structure. The law creates the system. The law sets the boundaries. And obviously, this is being above the law. This is someone inside conforms to the law. Someone outside is an architect of the law, right? So this person is obligated to the law. This person stands, quote unquote, above the law, as I just said. Okay, so then we go through. We have our noble lie. We have our noble lie. We have authority. We have determined action. All of this comes from Nietzsche. We have unempirical prescription. Right, unempirical prescription, non-physical sort of mandates of action, conformity, and so on. And this creates, all of this create, in combination,